Good morning and welcome to the SANEF and IAJ webinar on the role of the judiciary and the Office of the Chief Justice. My name is Candice Bailey. I'm from Intateli Media, and I'm one of your co-facilitators for today. Today's session is one of 5 webinars that are being hosted by SANEF and the IAJ on the relaunch of the manual, the Reporting the Courts manual. And I'm just going to hand over to Hopewell Khadebe for some opening remarks. Hopewell, over to you.
Very good morning, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your presence here today. We are blessed to have you, and we want to thank you for taking time to continue to listen to these webinars. We are almost there. Have patience with us. I think this is the third, and it's focusing on the Office of the Chief Justice and also itself the Constitutional Court, how it operates. So what we are hoping for is that you guys will be participating and making sure that you ask questions and you bother our guests to ask all the questions you need. Tomorrow we are even going to be looking at the covering the commissions. As we just finished the Zondo Commission, it's actually the right time to be debating these issues, including the one of today, which is the role of the judiciary and the Office of the Chief Justice. You know that we are busy as a nation, South Africa, looking for the Chief Justice. While the debates may seem to be what gender it is, but the whole process of how it has come about for the way they are chosen and selected and questioned, and also what's their role. And we know that they have been seen to be what you call as an impediment here and there about certain parties or faction of the ANC. So it's a great moment to be discussing this, to see that from the judicial perspective and the constitutional perspective, what is the role, and then we look at the debates that are happening around the country about whether or not they are involved in the politics of the nation, or whether they end up determining the politics of the country. So, but the last one is also, which will be on the 24th, I think it's next week. I hope you'd be attending that one. It's even more of my favorite because it is looking at how we can be, from the legal perspective, how we should be reporting children and other vulnerable groups. There is a whole lot of laws that we felt we needed a section to look into this, and also because when you have done your reporting, you can easily be accused as people who have acted outside the code of the media ethics, or maybe have breached the law. Worst of all, it's not just the code. There is a lot of laws that have been set up to make sure that they protect vulnerable groups, especially children.
So this morning we have a jam-packed program, and we've got some of the country's best legal minds involved in the panel that we want to share with you today. Joining us on the panel today, we've got Franny Rabkin, who is a legal journalist. Franny has been a legal reporter and an editor at some of South Africa's biggest titles, including the Mail and Guardian, the Business Day, the Sunday Times. She's covered the judiciary extensively in her career as a journalist, and she's also covered some landmark constitutional court judgments and some of the biggest cases in the country. Franny, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Joining Franny, we've got Lawson Naidu, who's the Executive Director of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, more commonly known as CASAC. So Lawson is a common face on our TV screens. The CASAC has been a regular media commentator on issues of political, constitutional, and legal issues. Welcome, Lawson. Thank you for joining us today. Joining Franny and Lawson, we've got Zikhona Ndlebe, who is a researcher and advocacy officer with Judges Matter. Now, Judges Matter monitors the issues of JSC appointments, the judges' appointments at the JSC, and it makes sure that there's transparency in the judiciary. It monitors the judiciary and does research into judicial governance processes and other topics of public interest. Zikhona, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. Joining Zikhona, we do have Mbigezeli Benjamin, who's not joining us as a panelist, but he will be on the chat and he will be part of the Q&A that we will discuss in a bit. Also joining Zikhona, Lawson, and Franny is Chelsea Ramsey, who is a senior legal researcher at the Helen Suzman Foundation. Now, the Helen Suzman Foundation has been very outspoken about issues of judicial independence, and it promotes legal constitutional democracy and the rule of law. Chelsea has an LLB and an LLM from the University of Johannesburg, and she's just recently returned from Dublin, where she's completed her LLM in international human rights law. Chelsea, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for being part of the panel. So for those of you who've just joined us, we are discussing the role of the judiciary and the Office of the Chief Justice. It's a live panel discussion, and we're doing it on behalf of SANEF and the IAJ, as part of their reporting the courts manual that they are relaunching this year, and the launch of the reporting the courts portal, which we are setting up as a tool for journalists to help you report the courts better and to understand issues of the courts better. My name is Candice Bailey, and I'm so glad that you are joining us today and you're part of this discussion. If you are live tweeting, the hashtag that you can use for the day is hashtag SANEF reporting the courts. And if you do have a question, we won't be opening up any live questions, but we do have a Q&A box that you can drop your questions in for the panelists, and we'll pick some of them up and use them as part of the discussion today. The panelists are going to be talking, and those who are not talking will be responding to the questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to hand over to my co-facilitator, Diane Walker, who's going to be managing the discussion and the panel discussion, and she's going to take you through the next 40 or so minutes. Diane, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. I am hoping that you will enjoy this discussion, which, as Candice said, will form part of the portal that SANEF has created. I'm a member of the SA National Editors Forum, and I was very happy to hear that there would be this portal created, because I think a lot of journalists do find it difficult to cover courts as well as to, in addition to covering the judiciary. And I wanted to just start, with someone who I recently spent a lot of time chatting about, issues about the judiciary with. Franny, if I could maybe just start with you. Tell me, why should people care about the judiciary? We spend so much time talking about the executive, but should people really even bother covering the judiciary?
Well, I think, seeing as how I've done it for the last 13 or so years, definitely yes. The judiciary is the third arm of state, for one thing. In our constitutional democracy, the way things are set up, we must never forget how powerful the judiciary is. In terms of our constitution, the judiciary can strike down legislation. It can set aside almost any executive action and conduct and declare it unconstitutional. It can create remedies that are just and equitable according to the Constitution. And so our judiciary is, under the Constitution, a very powerful institution. It is also unelected, and judges are, for good reason, appointed. Once they are appointed, it is extremely hard for them to be removed. So the accountability of the judiciary happens through judgments for the most part, and then through a JSC process. So the appointment of judges, the disciplinary processes around judges are crucial for us as the public to monitor and watch. I think the reporting of judgments, which is the way in which judges account for the most part for their work every single day, for us as the media to report them accurately and fairly, and to report court cases accurately and fairly, is one of the most important ways that the judiciary accounts for its work to the public. So we are almost like, most people won't read judgments. They'll read newspapers, or they'll watch television or listen to the radio. So our role in that is crucial, I think. That's the short answer, yeah.
So, I mean, you spoke about some really key stuff there. accountability, I think, is one of the key issues, and that's really something that CASAC and Judges Matter has really focused on, keeping that accountability. And I'm going to ask a question that I'm hoping that Zikhona and Lawson can answer in that order. When it comes to the accountability of judges, is there really enough focus given in the media on the process of their appointment, as well as the process of the sort of the disciplinary matters that eventually do make it to the public fore? And we can start with you, Zikhona. I hope we haven't lost Zikhona.
Zikhona, you appear to be on mute.
All right, I'll give Lawson the floor, and maybe Zikhona can come back a bit later.
Hi, Diane.
Oh,
Can
there
you
you
hear me
are
now?
with us.
Hi.
Yes, so
Thank
the
you.
disciplinary process as well as the appointment process, is there really enough focus on how these processes unfold within the judiciary?
Well, in recent times, we have seen that there has been focus on the appointment of judges. And that has been this year, 2022, and in 2021. But in the past, there's not been a lot of focus and transparency in how judges are appointed. So that has been a cause for concern, which is why we as Judges Matter took it upon ourselves to ensure that there is transparency in the appointment process of judges. And that is why we took it upon ourselves to ensure that the appointment process of judges, when they are sitting before the JSC and are being interviewed, that is live streamed. So that is the work that we have been doing as Judges Matter. And fortunately, the Office of the Chief Justice has now decided to live stream the appointment of judges and the JSC interviews itself, which is a good thing, because now we know that there is a certain amount of transparency in the appointment process. Although there is not enough transparency within the JSC and how it conducts its appointment process, how it decides which candidates to recommend for appointment to the president, which is something that we need to deal with and ensure that there is transparency in respect of that aspect going forward. And then when it comes to transparency in how judges are disciplined or held accountable, there is not enough transparency. There's not enough transparency if, well, I think that there's absolutely no transparency. There's no transparency at all, if I will put it bluntly. Because first of all, we don't know how many conduct cases the JSC, the JCC and the JCT deals with in a year. We only get an overview, which is not enough. So there's absolutely no transparency. So we need to ensure that something is done about that. And perhaps in the near future, at least there will be some sense of knowledge, or there will be some form of transparency into the conduct process. And I also want to go back to the first question that you posed to Franny, if you don't mind, which I think is a very important question. Why should people care about the judiciary? And the answer for me is that courts are the ultimate guardians of our constitution, the most important document that we have as a country post-apartheid is the constitution. It has our Bill of Rights, and courts are responsible to ensure that the constitution and the law is upheld. So I just wanted to touch on that, Diane, as well.
Thanks for that point, Zikhona. I think that's a very important point, for the journalists that are going to be viewing this to understand, because I think there is sometimes that overemphasis on the executive and leaving that other arm of government sort of unattended in a way. Lawson, did you want to come in there with an answer?
Well, just very briefly, to add to what Zikhona has said, really, transparency is obviously a critical factor, and we can certainly hope to see enhanced levels of transparency in the JSC in future. But I think that's also, inextricably linked to the fact that the JSC processes are opaque. We have, it's a question of really making it up as you go along, because there are, for example, there are no set criteria against which candidates for judicial office are being measured. There's no objective criteria. If you and I go for a job interview, there's a panel of people and they've got a sheet of paper in front of them about the key attributes, and there's a weighting system and all of that. In each person scores the candidates at the interview, and they convene at the end and they compare notes, etc. At the JSC, it's totally subjective. So you get to the extent where we saw a couple of weeks ago, someone being interviewed for 12 hours. I mean, that's just, cannot be right. If you cannot do the job in, 2, 3, maybe maximum 4 hours, then in my view, you're asking the wrong questions. And as a result of that lack of criteria, a lack of rules of procedure of the JSC, both in regard to the appointment as well as to the disciplinary processes, until we get that, there's going to be a level of suspicion by the broader public as to the integrity of those processes, whether they're not tainted by undue political influence, which, as you know, led to CASAC last year litigating against the JSC for the manner in which it conducted the April 2021 interviews for 2 vacancies on the Constitutional Court.
Now, I mean, the litigation aspect is obviously quite an important one, because we've seen it now come up. And of course, there's also this current, the most recent Chief Justice interviews where there's been a renewed sort of questions about that process. I want to bring Chelsea into the discussion here. And the Helen Suzman Foundation has been quite critical of the most recent Chief Justice interviews that we saw taking place just a few weeks ago. Actually saying that the nominee or the ultimate successful candidate would be getting a poison chalice. Now, we've seen Justice Mandisa Maya get that recommendation from the JNC. We still have to see the president making a decision, but it's a very important role, Chelsea, that role of the Chief Justice. That person is the leader of the judiciary, the leader of the third arm of government, and with the Helen Suzman Foundation saying that it's a poisoned chalice, is there a way that this new Chief Justice, whoever they are, can kind of rectify some of these issues about transparency and rectify some of the issues about the JSC process, but just also having ordinary South Africans have a better understanding of how the judiciary works?
Well, definitely, I think that the new Chief Justice could make some great changes and amendments. I mean, not only are they going to be the head of the judiciary, but they're also the chairperson of the JSC. So they can start by making or implementing changes. I know that there was mention at some time ago, it was reported that they were going to introduce criteria. However, we have not seen that yet. And with interviews coming up in April, that's something that needs to be addressed with quite a lot of urgency. In terms of the latest interviews, they were just a disservice to the public. As Lawson said, the lack of criteria means that you struggle to weight up any candidates. Without the criteria, the questions can't be determined beforehand, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and that would guide commissioners in asking the correct question. So that is a vital, important thing for the Chief Justice to get to. And it's important as well for, as the head of the judiciary, that they need to lead with the strength and integrity that will filter down throughout the judiciary to show that this is a strong leader and that they can stand up against the criticism or other arms of states or public that don't understand. There's a lot of lack of transparency in terms of, or lack of understanding of what happens in the court processes. And that is really important. I know that in the interviews, there were discussions about having an increased media presence of the judiciary. That's to explain judgments, or because many people don't read judgments, they just read what is reported or an outcome. And without that understanding, that's something that may be of use, but obviously judges shouldn't be seen to be defending themselves in the public either.
Absolutely. I think that we'll definitely come back to this issue, and thank you for some of you who've joined a little bit belatedly. We did have an issue with the link there. Just to give you some housekeeping rules, if you do have any questions that you're seeing based on the discussion, please feel free to put them into the chat. Candice Bailey, who is my co-facilitator, will be just monitoring that chat, and she'll also just alert the panelists if there are questions from the participants. We thank you for joining and apologize for the issues that we experienced there at the beginning. We've just started with some initial kind of questioning or discussion, and I now want to kind of go to the issue that I think a lot of journalists grapple with, and I want to go back to Franny. You know, there's the point where judges are appointed, which does get covered, and then there's the point where judges are disciplined, and there's sometimes a very big period in between where it's difficult to as a journalist figure out, is there a way for us to keep an eye or keep track of what is going on in the judiciary? As someone who's covered the courts for some time, what are the ways in which you can sort of in between the appointments and you know, later on in judges' careers, actually in any way keep track of what's going on in the court system? Are there methods that or resources that we as journalists are able to use to keep that close eye on the third arm of state?
Well, there's annual reports, which are supposed to be a good source of information. And what we've seen, when I started out as a journalist, there was one annual report that covered the judiciary, which was presented by the Justice Minister. There's now, I think, 4 annual reports. There's the one from the judiciary, there's the one from the Justice Department, there's the one from the OCJ. Oh no, I'm wrong. There were 2. There was a JSC annual report, and then there was a Justice annual report. There's now JSC, OCJ, judiciary, and JSC, judiciary, OCJ, and justice. And I don't know if you saw it recently, but I was trying for about, I don't know how long, to get the JSC annual reports, because unlike the others, I couldn't find them on the website. I couldn't track them down anywhere. I'd been asking for them. And one of the things that specifically the JSC annual reports are supposed to say is give you a sort of, they're supposed to track complaints. And we, I think Judges Matter had also been trying to do this, was to just get a sense of how many complaints were being made, how long they were taking to be resolved, what was happening to them. And that you can only do by looking at annual reports sort of over the course of time. And eventually, when I got the annual reports, what they showed was that you couldn't do that tracking exercise. And what I also discovered was that the parliamentary committee, which was supposed to be looking at these annual reports, hadn't seen them for some years. So keeping an eye on the judiciary over the years is very important. The reason why there's so many of them is because of, there has been, since the constitutional amendment, which I think came into force in 2013, there's been a move of the judiciary to govern itself. In other words, to be more independent and to, in terms of administration, to move away from justice. And that process is not quite complete. And we need a better monitoring of that. And I think that has been something that we have not done enough of, to be honest. So that's one way. Another way is to ask questions, which I have also tried to do, and which has been hard because questions are just not answered often. You'll remember in the last, what they call Judiciary Day, where the judiciary was giving its annual report. I put questions on the specific JSC annual report issue to the acting Chief Justice. He said, no, the Secretariat will give you the answers. I send them questions. I'm still waiting for those answers.
So Fanny, I just want to stop you there and bring in Mbegezeli, because I think you're raising a very important point about asking questions. And I know that, you know, one of the things that Judges Matter as well as the DGRU does is part of that asking questions. I think what you are talking about really is about having much more specific focus on the judiciary, which is something that these organizations do, and that journalists can really come in on that specific focus and almost like have a critical mass where they're paying so much attention to these issues that they can't be ignored. Mbegezeli, talk to us a little bit about some of the questions that Judges Matter asks or has been asking over the past few years to try and get that accountability and focus on the judiciary.
Thanks, Diane. The questions that we've asked are not dissimilar from the questions that Franny has asked. For example, on this issue of complaints, we have for quite a long time been asking very specific questions from different officials within the OCJ. And I must emphasize here that the OCJ is a national government department. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the Office of the Chief Justice, and then you think it's some sort of corner office at the Constitutional Court. But it is a whole national government department that is responsible for looking at the superior court judiciary. So from the High Court upwards, the OCJ is responsible for that. And it's also where the JSC sits, and that's where judicial appointments and misconduct cases are dealt with. So the questions that we've asked specifically of the OCJ about the complaints that have been filed against judges and the status of those complaints. We've asked them firstly by phone, just call up the secretary of the JSC and ask, hey, we've heard that there's this complaint against this judge. What is going on there? Can you give us information? And like Franny said, we've been met with dead ends to the point where we filed PIA applications. And as you know, a PIA application, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, that's a legal requirement. They must disclose that information. But there seems to be some reluctance to give out that kind of information. And I've been told informally that they've been reluctant, for example, to give out information about complaints because they are sometimes embarrassing to judges or whatever. But for us, sensitizing them to that transparency has been one of the goals that we've been pushing for, and it's a real struggle. But of course, there are ways of going around certain people. Franny mentioned annual reports. So I think it's a very, very key skill for journalists to have to monitor Parliament, especially the Justice Committee. There's a website called pmg.org.za, which puts out minutes of the Justice Committee meetings. You don't need to have a skilled hand in looking at those minutes. You just scan through them, look at what has been said about the judiciary, try and ask for the parliamentary program, because those meetings are announced ahead of time, and try and keep an eye on some of those things, because sometimes you might not find information directly from the official in the government, but it might leak somehow in Parliament. So you need to always keep a track of how that information flows. But the second question that we've always asked the JSC is in relation to the criteria. For many, many years, we've been asking, how do you decide on judicial appointments? How do you decide which candidate was stronger than the other? What factors played a role in this? And then I think it got to the point where I think in the last interviews for the Chief Justice, Commissioner Mpofu got so annoyed and said, if it wasn't clear, we'll now clarify it. We'll hold a workshop before the April interviews, where we'll set out clear written criteria of how the JSC takes its decisions, which goes to show that being persistent in some of these questions does yield some sort of results. It is slow, it is frustrating, as Franny would tell us, that you send questions and they sort of fall into this black hole, never to return. So it is about persistence.
Thanks, Mbegezeli. I just want to bring Chelsea and Lawson in here. Persistence is a very important issue. And also just having an open office of the Chief Justice. Incidentally, I did want to just inform the panelists that we did invite a representative from the Office of the Chief Justice, Nathi Mncube, to join this discussion, and he said that he wasn't able to. It would have been great to have someone from the Office of the Chief Justice with us so that we're not only talking about them, but have someone in the conversation with us. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us. But maybe this will also form as a catalyst to get the OCJ to be a bit more open. Now, Lawson and Chelsea, what I wanted to just speak about is one of the questions that came up at the JSC interviews, where they were asking about whether this issue of transparency and openness. And some of the candidates made mention of the annual Judiciary Day as a day for accountability for the Chief Justice or for the Office of the Chief Justice. And I thought it a bit strange. I thought, in a year of 365 days, surely one day is not sufficient for the OCJ to be accountable. Do you think that the annual Judiciary Day is enough for the judiciary, which has been talking about transparency and independence to actually be transparent to South Africans? Lawson, you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. But before I come to that, I wanted to make a comment on what Mbekizeli and Franny had just spoken about, the non-responsiveness of the OCJ and the JSE. And we made the point earlier in the conversation about the courts being the custodians of our constitution, which is an important point to make. And the founding values of our constitution include accountability, responsiveness, and openness. And the JSE and the OCJ flout that with impunity. And that comes to this issue of the annual Judiciary Day. It's not a substitute for them accounting to Parliament, which is what they are required to do in terms of the Constitution. Now, the President accounts to Parliament, imperfect as that might be. What sets the Chief Justice apart from not appearing before Parliament and accounting directly to Parliament? I think that's a serious question that we need to engage with, and certainly hoping that's something that the new Chief Justice will take more seriously, that responsibility of ensuring proper accountability to our elected representatives in the National Assembly.
All right, Chelsea, do you want to tackle the issue of the annual Judiciary Day, and is it sufficient to account? And perhaps if you have any suggestions on how better the judiciary can account, or how better journalists and media practitioners can hold the judiciary accountable.
Well, I definitely do think one day of a year is not sufficient. And as has been mentioned, the annual reports, when they are even available, haven't been discussed and scrutinized by Parliament. How to make it better, I'm not entirely certain. I do know that what would be useful is, say, the JSC having a website where people would not have to sift through the judiciary or the OCJ's website to find all the information. I get a lot of my information when it comes to the JSC, or at least on judges, from Judges Matter. I mean, I find their site a lot more useful and helpful than the actual judiciary or the OCJ themselves. So I think that's something they really do need to look at. And I think that if you have something that is accessible and open, that would allow the public to understand it a lot more better. I mean, just going on and as they're looking for the JSC, finding who the commissioners are is enough of a battle on its own. And I mean, I do understand they change, but that should be something that's easily updatable. It doesn't have to be anything scandalous. So I think just general open practices throughout the year in terms of what they're doing, how they're participating, and that would be the beginning of a significant difference in terms of the openness and transparency of the judiciary.
And I see Lawson nodding there. So definitely a message to pass on to the OCJ and to the JSC that a better website could do them some good and also create some more openness. Candace, I just wanted to check if there were any questions that the panelists could tackle from the audience members, if there's anything that has come through
There's one question, Dan, and it's from Bilal Zwai, and his question is, why is the Office of the Chief Justice defending outright corruption taking place in the courts? Strange enough, no decision is ever taken to suspend court officials involved in corruption scandals, despite clear evidence of corruption and wrongdoing. A bit of a comment, but there is a question, why is the Office of the Chief Justice defending outright corruption taking place in the courts? I'm not sure who would want to take that. Maybe Lawson would want to start off. He was about...
I'm going to hand this over to to Judges Matter. I think they're better positioned to answer this than I am, and perhaps Franny as well.
Because
can I just add another one that I just saw in the different part of the chat? It actually comes from Hopewell. He's asking about the issue of politicians handling the interviews of judges, and I think that's a very important one to clarify as to why that happens. It's something that I saw being discussed a lot on Twitter with the Chief Justice interviews, and not many people know why the Judicial Service Commission is set up the way that it is. So perhaps if Zikhona could handle one and Mbegezeli could handle the other, the issue of corruption and then the issue of the composition of the JSC itself.
Thank you, Diane. I'll take the issue of corruption. You know, in the recent research that we've been doing, we've also come across a problem that exists in the judiciary, which is corruption. And that problem, there is a perception that there is corruption in the judiciary. And there is a lack of trust in our judiciary because of that perception. And this has been dealt with by, well, the Afrobarometer conducted the research, you know, and it's something that we're also looking into. Where is this perception stemming from? That is something that we need to dig deep into and try to determine, so that those people that should be held accountable for this perception or for the actual existence of corruption in the judiciary are held to account. But if there is any such perception, for example, in the lower courts, because sometimes it is it is predominantly in the lower courts that there's this perception, the magistrates' courts. So our question has been, is it the clerks of the courts that are corrupt? Is it the magistrate? Is it the security guards? Who is it that is actually corrupt within the judiciary? So that is something that needs to be dealt with. And what I can say is that if anyone does come or finds that there is actually corruption, they need to report the issue firstly to the head of the court. And then if it is a judicial officer, if it is in the magistrates court, then that has to be reported to the head of the court and then to the magistrates commission, which also deals with complaints within the magistracy, and it is similar to the JSC. And if there is such a problem in the superior courts, that has to be a complaint has to be lodged to the JSC if it is a judge that is perceived to be corrupt. So there are platforms, but as we have been discussing, these platforms are taking too long to resolve complaints. There is no transparency. That is an issue. It's a systematic problem that has to be dealt with within the JSC. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay. Mbegezeli, the composition of the JSC is something that has confounded many South Africans and even journalists.
Yeah, just a small point to add before I answer that question. But the issue of corruption is like Zikhona said, we've been trying very hard to research and find out, and actually running a second round of surveys now to try and figure out where people perceive this corruption to be coming from, because people say it's the judiciary, and the judiciary has so many moving parts that it's difficult to track down. But of course, one of the elements we've seen, and judges have told us this, that it comes with fraudulent court orders. So that also involves private lawyers, it involves court officials, and so it's a complex problem. And we wish that Bilal can maybe give us more details, and we can try and sort of follow up with, if at all possible. But of course, they must report it to the authorities, the police, the OCJ, the JSC, and the Magistrates Commission if they feel necessary. The NPA as well. We've heard prosecutors also being involved in corruption, although we don't have concrete evidence of this. But back to the question of the composition of the JSC. So the JSC is quite a unique body. When it was established in the late 90s with the new constitution, there was actually, it came from a sense of mistrust, The politicians didn't trust the apartheid judiciary to deliver justice. They didn't, also the previous ways of appointing judges was a bit suspect in that the justice minister really picked whomever they wanted, and sometimes they got very pliant advocates to come on as judges on the bench. So there was this sense of mistrust, and so they decided to come up with this body, which is made up of practicing lawyers, of judges and politicians to come together and appoint the judges. And actually the makeup of the JSC, there are about 10 politicians. Well, let me stop using the word politicians, because as these latest interviews have shown us, the politicians are not only the members of parliament, but there are 10 members of parliament, four from the National Council of Provinces, 6 from the National Assembly, including opposition parties. They all come together and form part of the JSC, which is made up of about 23 members. So 10 of the members are members of parliament. And the role of the members of parliament is actually a very vital one. They represent members of the public. They are public representatives. So they are meant to bring up the issues that the public care about when it comes to the appointment of judges. Often the lawyers would ask the legal questions, and the members of the MPs on the JSC will ask the more social context questions about, for example, if you are a judge of the Western Cape High Court, you need to have an understanding of how crime and poverty are linked. You need to have an understanding of how crime manifests itself on the Cape Flats, in the suburbs closer to the mountain, in the northern suburbs, all the way to Stellenbosch and other parts of the Western Cape. You need to have an understanding of that. And the politicians are sometimes very good at bringing up those issues, those social context questions. The other thing is, sorry, the Constitution gives the judiciary, as Franny said at the beginning of this, gives the judiciary the power to review and set aside the decisions by the elected arms of government, by parliament and the executive, which is government. That is a huge power. That is a power that very few judiciaries in the world have, and at least not to the extent that our judges have. So a judge needs to be aware of more than just the law, but the political and social implications of their court decisions. And so the politicians are meant to also tease out a judge's understanding of those dynamics and understanding of the power that they wield when they are making decisions on the courts. So that is the role of the politicians, of the members of parliament, at least on the JSC. Of course, they play this role to a greater or lesser extent. Sometimes the spotlight just carries them away, and you'll often find that they'll bring up issues that are really related to their political party much more than us as the public. But really, that is the role of the politicians or the members of parliament on the JSC.
Thanks, Mbegezeli. So our time is running close to the end now, but before we wrap up, I want to just give the different panelists an opportunity to just give us some closing remarks, and really in those closing remarks to also just consider some tips and advice for journalists who are now kind of watching the judicial process. Maybe they are new, starting out in the field, or maybe they've just, been paying close attention to the most recent Chief Justice interviews. We know that in April, there will be new interviews for judges at different courts, and it will give an opportunity for journalists to once again cover that process. So starting with Franny and then moving on to Lawson, if you could give us some closing remarks as well as some tips for journalists on the things that they should look out for.
Franny, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I think the thing that I really appreciate is that, I've been reporting the judiciary for many years now, and it sometimes felt like almost it was me and Chris Oxtoby sitting by ourselves in the JSC, it's very mainstream now. People are following it and debating it and engaging in it, and I think that is fantastic. With these last interviews, when they started, and it was all over Twitter and everyone was talking about it, and there was Team Matanga and Team Maya, and I really like the way it has engaged public attention, and I think the fact that we have Judges Matter, CASAC, Helen Suzman Foundation, all focusing on this and talking about this and raising public awareness about this, as well as the media, is a great thing. For journalists, what I would advise is just to have a careful look at the Constitution and the JSC Act. I think that's when you go in there to be empowered by the framing, the legislative framing really helps, because then you're just able to know what the parameters are of what you're dealing with. I also think that one of our problems in South African media is that, especially with legal reporting, is that we have short memories. So many of the issues that, you know, when I look at some of the things that people are raising about the JSC today, none of it is new. There have been concerns about the JSC for years. There have been outcries about the JSC for years. And in order to really give good journalism and good context, we must refresh our memories about some of those debates that have been ongoing for a long time. That's my best advice to journalists who are covering these things from the beginning, is just to go back a little.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Franny. And I think you're definitely one of those people who has that institutional memory, as well as Karen, who's worked on it, Chris Oxtoby from the DGRU. I mean, he's been attending these things for years. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the resources that are available for journalists after we wrap the discussion. So just Lawson, some closing remarks from you, and also tips for journalists who are thinking about now getting more involved in covering the judiciary, how they can do it adequately to inform the public.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, Franny's covered a lot of that, you know, to look at the Constitution, look at the JSC Act, which is not a long piece of legislation, but, you know, give you a good sense of what we should be expecting from the judiciary and the component parts of it. But I think, you know, there are a couple of issues that we've not touched on. So one is, you know, the political attacks against the judiciary and individual judges in particular, and to really try to understand the context in which those political attacks come. And they're not new. Yes, we've seen a lot of it in recent times, but you know, I can recall back in 2008, 2009, judges being called counter-revolutionaries by senior figures within the ruling party. So this is not a new dimension, and it's something that we need to understand and put it into its context. We see it play out, as Mbekizeli has said, during the interviews of candidates for judicial office, and so on. And I think, you know, we probably need a whole separate discussion on the issue of the composition of the judiciary and a review of that composition. Because once again, you know, it was a body that was constituted in the mid-1990s with very little trust in the old apartheid judges. But we now have a cohort of retired judges from the democratic era, a significant cohort of those judges who have experience, who have credibility. And I think we should be making greater use, for example, of retired judges as part of the Judicial Service Commission. And so I think that's a debate that's going to be ongoing. And I think it's something that journalists should also be focusing on.
Great insights there, Lawson. I think quite an interesting suggestion that you're coming with. Of course, that would require, you know, a parliamentary intervention, and it's something that was discussed in the JSC hearings, whether there isn't perhaps a need for a parliamentary intervention, and that kind of is that interlap or that overlap that we see between politics and the judiciary. There's a constant back and forth there, and I think it will be important, especially for those interested in politics, to keep a close eye on the judiciary, because there are significant overlaps in the two areas. Let me go to Chelsea now as we wrap up. Some of your closing remarks, and if you have any tips for journalists covering the judiciary.
Well, yeah, I must agree with Lawson when it comes to the composition. That is something that needs to be considered, and that will be something that would take up a lot of time as well. I know during the certification of the Constitution, in that judgment, they say that it is up to Parliament to determine the composition. And the Helen Suzman Foundation last year actually made a submission to the to Parliament on the annual review of the Constitution, recommending that they are perfectly placed right now to make these changes. So that's something we have been looking at, and something we will continue to be paying close attention to. In terms of journalists and reporting on this, I think they must just always keep in mind, and this also speaks to what Lawson was saying about the latest critiques and even the previous critiques of the judges, and that is that they need to remember that there are so many underlying levels of different power structures at play. And those are really important to, when you're writing, to look at what the intention of that statement is behind it. It's never normally as clear as what they say it is.
All right. And then Zikhona, from Judges Matters perspective, some closing remarks and any tips for journalists who are trying to get into this area?
Just like Chelsea has said, Diane, I would basically say that journalists cannot take anything on face value. Any of the information that they get, a lot of work has to be done around it, and a lot of digging as to the purpose of the information being given to you. So obviously, as Chelsea has said, there are a lot of power structures that come into play in this field. And as Franny has said, you know, the Constitution is always the first document that you need to look at when it comes to the law. From chapter 8, that is, if you don't have the time to look at the Constitution, journalists need to look at the Constitution, chapter 8. And then just a concern that I have or had last year when Judiciary Day took place. It's just the last point that I want to make, Diane. You know, there was some form of accounting in the Superior Courts by the acting Chief Justice. But if you notice, there was no accounting for the lower courts. So that's an issue that we need to also look at as journalists, because the issue of a single judiciary is going to come into play at some point in the future. There are talks of a single judiciary, and we heard from the candidates that were interviewed for this CJ position. They also mentioned the issue of a single judiciary. So that is something that we should also be on the lookout for, that should come into play not long from now, hopefully.
All right. Thank you to all the panelists. Feel free to hang on if you would like to. Candice and I are just going to take the participants through some of the resources that we thought could be quite helpful, because I think, you know, one of the things that can be challenging for someone who hasn't covered the judiciary is actually just to find the information, to figure out where do they go first. And, you know, this website, the judiciary.org website, has definitely improved over time. I've noticed that sometimes there is a lag on the update on that website, but it does have, you know, relevant information for journalists, such as the locations of the different courts. It does usually have information on the leadership of the judiciary, as well as short biographies. And one of the YouTube channels that I've subscribed to is the Office of the Chief Justice YouTube channel. Part of the reason why is that now with COVID-19 and many of the court proceedings being streamed live, this is a place where you will often find those court proceedings streamed. And they do also have some other events that they post there from time to time, such as when they have Office of the Chief Justice events, then they will also put that on the Office of the Chief Justice website, as well as their YouTube channel. So I think it's an important place to look for resources and to check from time to time. Candice, can you move on to the next one? All right, the Constitutional Court website, I find from a journalist reporting perspective, when reporting on kind of big cases that end up at the Constitutional Court. It's one of the most organized websites, and it has a lot of resources that are readily available. It lists the forthcoming hearings, it lists the latest judgments, but you can also find previous judgments on there, which I find quite interesting, because there are times where you will want to kind of look back and see what was said in another judgment before. It also has the court roll for the upcoming cases at the Constitutional Court. And I do find that the Registrar's Office at the Concourt is very helpful when sometimes I've heard that there might be a case that was submitted at the Concourt, but I don't have the actual paperwork for it. I would email them, and as long as you have the case number or an idea about what the case is about, they actually will very readily email you that information. And I found them to be very, very helpful in that regard. So spend some time on the Concourt website, and I think you'll find that to be a great resource. We can move on to the next one. The Supreme Court of Appeal website, also quite useful. It does have the court roll, it has judgments, it has historical judgments, which is also quite useful. And because sometimes you'll want to refer back, for example, if a case then goes to the Constitutional Court, you might want to refer back to the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment and what was initially said there. And it does list the judgments by year. So I find that very, very useful, because you can just go to, the year 2020, the year 2021, whatever it is, and you can find the relevant judgment there. On to the next one, please, Candace. All right. Now, this one, the SAFLI website is a bit of a more deep website for those who are a bit more of on the court nerd side of the world, but I find it extremely, extremely useful. Basically, this organization has tried to post as many judgments from courts all around the country. If you go onto this website, you'll actually see that it lists the judgments from the different courts based on province, and then it will also have Concourt and Supreme Court of Appeal. I looked at it just the other day, and it even had judgments that go back as far back as the 70s. So what's really great about it is if you know the case number, you can usually put in the case number. So this is either the High Court or the Concourt or the SCA case number, and it will help you find that judgment. I've used it so many times over the years, because sometimes you just want to know what was said at the High Court level to carry on to the other levels. So it is a very, very useful website. And I think this might be, is there one more, Candace? Oh, Judges Matter website. Yes, there is one more. So in terms of specifically looking at the judiciary, I found the Judges Matter website as well as their YouTube page to be extremely helpful. For example, it will usually have profiles on the judges that are being interviewed ahead of the interviews. It often also has links to previous interviews and the highlights of those interviews. They post regular articles on there, and really thank you to Mbegezeli and Zikhona and the team at Judges Matter for creating this great resource. If you go onto the Judges Matter YouTube page, for example, they've also included some of the older hearings that haven't been covered and you won't find on the OCJ website. So for example, when I was looking at trying to refresh my mind in the previous April interviews for some of the Concourt interviews, I went onto the Judges Matter website and I was able to re-watch interviews from a year or 2 years ago. And I found that extremely helpful, because then I would know what has already been asked of a particular candidate and whether there's any kind of issue that might come up again in an interview. So it's very useful. It does post other documents, the Judiciary Annual Report, composition of the Judicial Service Commission, and a couple of other things there. So spend some time on that website. You'll find it very useful. All right. And then just for those who are interested in joining our next webinar, it will be taking place tomorrow. Perhaps I can give Candace an opportunity just to talk a little bit about what we're going to focus on with this webinar.
Thanks, Diane.
Webinar.
Just for all of you who are able to attend the webinar tomorrow, we're looking at reporting on children and vulnerable groups. Now, this is obviously a very important issue to look at, because there are certain ways that we need to think about when we, or things that we need to think about when we're reporting on children, when we're reporting on issues of gender-based violence, for example, in the courts, when we're reporting on issues of migration and even xenophobia. We've got a wonderful panel of experts on the team tomorrow, including Lisa Fetton from the University of Johannesburg. She's been a gender-based violence activist for a long time. She's been researching for more than 20 years. Shahida Omar from the Teddy Bear Clinic is also involved. Zikhona Chona is bringing the journalistic perspective tomorrow in terms of her experiences of covering children in the courts, as well as Kudukwa Shivanyoro, who is from the African Center for Migration and Society at WITS. So if you can join us, we will be sending out a invitation and the link again today. If you can register, that would be great, and please feel free to join us tomorrow. At this point, I want to just say thank you to all the panelists for chatting to us today.
I'm so sorry for interjecting. I just wanted to mention one small bit that I had forgotten. But we, with the DGRU at UCT, will be announcing a cash prize for a journalist who has the best story on the judiciary. That announcement will be coming in the next few days. That cash prize is to really award or reward a journalist who's done a good job in the last year or so in covering a story relating to the judiciary. We'll be calling for applications, and we'll have a panel of judges, which includes lawyers, judges, and journalists who will assess the applications, and then they will decide on the winning entry. So we'll announce that in the next few days.
That's fascinating. Will the details be available on the Judges Matter website in Bigazeli?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll also share it with SANEF and IHA.
That's inspiration for everybody to go to the Judges Matter website, which we've heard is quite an amazing resource for people who are covering the court. So go and look at the website and see if you can get details on that competition that Mbigazeli just mentioned, and the cash prize that is going to be issued for people who are covering the judiciary. Mbigazeli, thank you so much for that. Mbigazeli, Chelsea and Zikhona have also put in some resources into the chat if you are looking for them. Just some other places where you can get some helpful information if you are covering the courts. Mbigazeli, Franny, Lawson, Chelsea, and Zikhona, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for being part of the session. On behalf of SANEF and the IAJ, we really appreciate your time and your insights, and keep doing the wonderful work that you've been doing, raising issues of accountability and transparency within the judiciary.
Thank you, Candice.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.